America was in no way a Christian nation.
And they made it quite clear that they were in the United States on a religious project.
And yet this man is the author of the American Revolution. Now, why is it that at the end of his life, he's treated with such disregard and contempt? It might have something to do with the fact that his own personal religious beliefs were, in no uncertain terms, not Christian.
The nation, I think we all would have to agree, is predicated on the notion that God exists and created us and gave us rights.
Separation of church and state likely does not mean what you think it does. And America is 100% a Christian nation. I'll tell you why today on Indie Thinker. Welcome to the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Today's show is sponsored by our friends over at Sailor Ridge. If you're looking for the perfect vacation spot, and trust me, you don't want to miss the weather in North Georgia as we get closer to the fall. You need to check out our friends over at Sailor Ridge. They've got great amenities, 3 amazing properties that you will just absolutely have a memorable vacation the time of your life. In order to see all that they have to offer you and your family, go to SailorRidgeTreeSort.com. And when you book, don't forget to use the promo code indiethinker. A little known story is that a 90-foot statue of a Hindu monkey god was just erected in Texas. Now, this is the 3rd largest statue in America to date. So the first is the Statue of Liberty, which of course symbolizes the feminine virtue of liberty and freedom. And then of course we have the Pegasus and dragon, which is in Florida, and it's a representation, albeit kind of a Greek mythology one, of good overcoming evil. And then of course this monkey statue, I can only imagine, is a representation of monkeypox. Now I'm just kidding. Gay agenda aside, I don't really think there's a correlation there. A lot of people speculated online, but I think this is more properly a indication of our secular nation and the fact that as we become less Christian, we're making more room for these kind of false gods. As G.K. Chesterton said, when men stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, it's that they'll believe in anything. And this is proof positive of that. Let me give you kind of a short argument to underscore this, that we don't see statues to Buddha and to Indian gods and Hindu gods all around the United States. The reason for that is because we are not a Hindu nation, and we are not even a nation of just religious pluralism. We are a Christian nation. That's why our symbolism is much more at home in kind of Christian circles. But as we have become a less Christian nation, things like this can be expected more and more and more. Right now, among Christians, it says that only 30% of professing Protestant Christians go to church every single week, 27%, so almost as many, seldom go, and 16% never go. Now, you 16% out there who are professed Christians and never go to church, we got to get you a Bible. But more importantly, all people in America, statistics tell us recently that 56% of Americans seldom go to church or never go to church. So I think it's fair to say that right now we are living in one of the most dramatic post-Christian shifts in American history, and we can expect more things like this monkey statue to crop up as we become less Christian. Now, the first thing that people are going to say when they hear this is they're going to say, Reed, we are not and have never been a Christian nation. How dare you offend my secular sensibilities? I think that is totally incorrect. And Micheal Knowles and Alex O'Connor had a conversation about whether or not we are a Christian nation, and it's probably one of the more substantive ones I've ever heard. So for those of you who don't think we are, I think it's important for you to engage in this subject. For those who know that we are, and you want to speak to your friends about this, I think you're going to hear some information today that will help you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, realize that we are a Christian nation, and regardless of what your religious affiliation is, you probably want to keep it that way. But I'll argue that more toward the end. More importantly, let's jump into Micheal Knowles and Alex O'Connor.
Let's say a more political tone, that is, this description of Christian nationalism as a sort of right-wing danger to the fabric of America, in the way that a lot of right-wingers will see left-wing radical wokists as a danger to the fabric of America. And so the focus is, I suppose, maybe more on the nationalism part than the Christian part. But there's also just this historical question, which is the one that I'm more interested in, which is less about, let's say, the danger of people who today believe in the existence of God and the risks that they might pose to American democracy, whatever that might mean. But whether the country that you're in is best described in a historical sense as a Christian nation. And I've heard you say before that it is. And I've heard you use phrases like the soul of America is Christian and saying things like this. And I suppose the first thing I wanted to clarify is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you do say that America is a Christian nation, or perhaps ought to be a Christian nation, are you talking here legally, like in terms of the documents, the Constitution, or are you just talking about the culture or something like that, or the philosophy undergirding the legal element of this conversation?
I don't always neatly separate these two things. I know that some American libertarians are fond of saying that, politics is totally distinct from culture or something like that. I think that's all a little bit silly. I think what we're talking about here when we talk about the soul of a country is a nation's constitution, capital C, and a nation's constitution, lowercase c. And that laws and customs and taboos and ends and goals are not so neatly separable. So another problem, I suppose, with Americans being a little dismissive of history is that we pick arbitrary dates to start looking at our own history. So typically, Americans look at 1776, or else, a little over a decade later at the Constitutional Convention, and they will say, this is the beginning of America. But it does cause one to ask, well, hold on, where did those people come from? How did they get there? And so America begins a little earlier than that. I would trace it to 1620, to the Mayflower. One could, I suppose, trace it in different parts even earlier than that. But in any case, wherever you trace it to, the men who came there broadly were Christian. They certainly came from a Christian culture. And where Americans have long found their origin is in the Mayflower, among men who were extraordinarily zealous separatist Christians. In fact, I'm not an academic historian or even a trained apologist or theologian. I am a cigar salesman, and I've named my cigar company Mayflower after those very men. Some of my ancestors were on that boat, and they made it quite clear that they were in the United States on a religious project, the country that would become the United States, on a religious project. And then the Puritans who followed the Pilgrims were had slight distinctions from them theologically, but were broadly the same. And so Governor John Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he declared that America would be a shining city on a hill in a famous speech called A Model of Christian Charity. And all the way up through the Revolution, Americans considered themselves to be Christian. The Founding Fathers were a little bit of a hodgepodge of Freemasons and deists, but there were a number of vaguely faithful-seeming Christians among them, and even the ones who were not particularly orthodox in their Christianity, at least recognize the importance of Christianity to the country. So you have a founding father, author of the Federalist Papers, and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. He said that Christianity must be the religion of the United States. He thanked God that the country had the same religion, were descended from the same stock. He went so far as to say that non-Christians should never hold public office. Now, there's no religious test for office in the Constitution, but there are religious parameters around the country. So if you go back to the philosophical founding document, the Declaration, it begins and predicates the nation on the notion that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So I'm not trying to convince you here that this is a papal bull or this is, some particularly sectarian version of Christianity. But at the very least, the nation, I think we all would have to agree, is predicated on the notion that God exists and created us and gave us rights. And then in practice, America developed far more clearly in a Christian manner, so much so that in our national anthem, in the little heard final verse, the final stanza, Francis Scott Key writes, "Conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, and God is our trust," and it's inscribed on our money, and it's in our Pledge of Allegiance. So, I think one can quibble over quite how orthodox or rigorous the Christianity of America was, but it's simply an historical fact that it was Christian men who were motivated by Christian ideas, who created Christian institutions, who founded the country, whether it was consciously Christian or not.
I think this is brilliantly defended by Micheal Knowles here. And I do have to say, the one response that I thought of coming away from their first part of the conversation here is that the dangers of Christian nationalism to me, always seemed like a cynical retort by the woke left. They were going increasingly left and getting increasingly radical, so they had to figure out something to call their enemies so that they didn't look like the radicals. And of course, the first thing that they came up with was they're Christian nationalist. And so anybody that believes that this nation is a Christian nation all of a sudden is some kind of fascist. However, that is to be totally historically illiterate of a couple of different things. And Micheal Knowles, I think, really displays this beautifully. Because when you think about what America is, you have to think lowercase c Constitution and uppercase C Constitution. And I can only imagine he means by lowercase c, he means kind of the philosophies and the ideas and the values that undergirded our uppercase C Constitution. And you can see this in the Federalist Papers, that the Federalist Papers, and I think specifically John Madison, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think it was Alexander Hamilton, but anyway, are arguing that what took place in the Revolutionary War and our fight for dependence, that whole philosophy is embodied in our Constitution. So in other words, in order to know what the Constitution is all about, that more formal document about the establishment of our government, you must understand the Declaration of Independence. So there is a philosophy that undergirds the institutions of America, and you need to know what that is if you're going to truly understand those institutions. So I would say that the philosophy that has always undergirded America is undeniably Christian. Now, I can point you back to abolition and show you that in order for abolition to take place in America, guess what abolitionists appealed to? Well, they appealed to Christian morality and ethics and values. And of course, more recently, civil rights. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian pastor, and he appealed to the religious notions and the moral sentiments of a Christian nation in order to cash that check that was written in our Constitution and in our Declaration of Independence. So he called upon the Christian sentiments of people to get them to come back to the reality of what our nation is supposed to be. Now, we could argue back and forth about other kind of movements in America and how predicated they are upon secularism, but I just want to simply focus on the uppercase C documents that founded our nation to truly show beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are a Christian nation. And the vast majority of people who argue that we are not just simply put a date that is not far enough back, I think. Micheal argues this, and I think we can see this clearly in the Mayflower Compact, which I would argue is one of our founding documents. And at the beginning of the Mayflower Compact, it says this: having undertaken for the glory of God. Oh shoot, typo again. Apparently they didn't consult Richard Dawkins before writing this, but nonetheless, there it is. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of Christian faith. Darn it, there they go again. For king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in northern parts of Virginia. So the first colony in Virginia was predicated upon the glory of God and the advancement of Christian faith. Those bunch of pagans. I think you get the point that from the earliest days, the settlements that we were creating were Christian in nature. Now, I think we could even push further back and take note of the fact that under King James, the Puritans that were coming to America were doing so not to flee Christianity, but to flee religious persecution so that they could have freedom as Christians. And you can even go as far back as the Anabaptists. If you never studied them, I would highly encourage you to, because they were being persecuted because they didn't want to baptize their babies because they believed in adult professions of faith and that you're not saved through baptism, and that was anathema. And so these Anabaptists fled to America because they didn't want to be killed because of their belief in baptism. So the undergirding of our nation from its earliest days was for the glory of God and for the advancement of Christian faith and for the pursuit of religious liberty, and that cannot be forgotten. And then you also need to look at our Declaration of Independence. That starts, at least in the second paragraph, and says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So unfortunately, Joe Biden was wrong. It wasn't "you know the thing."
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
It was a creator. Well, what creator would that have been? Nobody really has to guess about this. We all know. It's the Christian God of the Christian Bible. That's what creator they're referring to here. And then, of course, most people say, yeah, well, that's fine, Reed, but what about our Constitution? It was creating a secular republic, not some Christian nation. That represents a last-ditch effort on the part of many atheists and secularists and humanists who want to try to deny the obvious. Of course, the Constitution is a formal document outlining the separation of powers, but there is no Constitution without the Mayflower Compact, without the Declaration of Independence, and without what Charlie Kirk shows us in this clip that went viral. Perhaps this is the most compelling argument I've ever heard on the idea of the separation of church and state. It's a little bit of a long argument, but it's well worth it because it's not easy to argue in less than 3 minutes just how Christian a nation we are.
Remember that we were a collection of states and colonies, and you need to read the state constitutions before anything else. 9 out of 13 of the original states required you to be a Bible-believing Christian to serve in government at the time of the founding. You could even in actually 13 out of 13 required a declaration of faith. 9 out of 13 required you to be a Protestant, except Maryland, which was Catholic, which still required a declaration of faith. In almost every single one of the original state constitutions, Pennsylvania included, they had, "I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior" in the original state constitutions. So you remember, we're a collection of states before that. Secondly, 55 out of 56 of the original signers of the Declaration were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians. You asked about common law. So common law is inherited from Blackstone, who was Christian. Common law is an outgrowth of the Scriptures. So let's go to 3 principles of common law: presumption of innocence, due process, and jury of your peers. All 3 are biblical principles. So, and all wrapped into the ultimate biblical principle that you shall not favor justice if you are rich or poor, which is in Leviticus 19, right before the most famous part of Leviticus 19, which is that you should love your neighbor as yourself. But before that is that in the administration of justice, you shall not favor the rich or the poor, which is the idea of blind justice. We get that in the West, which is incorporated also in the New Testament ideal: neither slave nor Greek nor Jew, you're all one in Jesus Christ, which we get the idea of human equality. These are all biblical ideas. They're not Enlightenment ideas, which is they kind of get conflated at the time. But more importantly than that, they say that God was only mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's a big deal, okay? Laws of nature and nature's God. The last paragraph of the Declaration reads as a prayer. It says, "We appeal to the supreme judge of the universe." Who's the judge of the universe? Jesus Christ, as it says in Revelation, that Jesus will judge the earth on his throne. So in the Declaration, they were praying to Christ our Lord as a prayer very specifically. Thirdly, as I said on the stage yesterday, Deuteronomy was by far the most quoted book, religious or non-religious, in the time of the founding when they were putting together the Constitution, more than John Locke, more than Montesquieu, more than Blackstone. So the book of Deuteronomy, which talked about laws, customs, traditions. It was Moses' farewell address as he's about to say goodbye, say, "Hey, good luck in Canaan, guys. Here's how you should set up your form of government." But finally, and most importantly, let's look at actually what the founders said. John Adams famously said the Constitution was only written for a moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate for the people of any other. The body politic of America was so Christian and was so Protestant that our form and structure of government was built for the people that believed in Christ our Lord. One of the reasons we're living through a constitutional crisis is that we no longer have a Christian nation, but we have a Christian form of government, and they're incompatible. So you cannot have liberty if you do not have a Christian population.
I've never heard the argument for our Christian nation put more succinctly and more powerfully. And I have never heard anybody retort as equally poignantly and historically as Charlie Kirk just did. I think that's going to be embodied as we go to the next clip of Alex O'Connor responding to Micheal Knowles and his idea of uppercase C and lowercase c. So here's Alex O'Connor kind of giving his rebuttal to the idea that we are a Christian nation.
We have quite good insights into the writings, the private thoughts, even from their letters and things, of the founders of the country that we now see today. So I think one of the most underrated, let's say, even though he is quite highly rated, of the founding fathers is, of course, Thomas Paine, without whom the revolution may not have taken place. I mean, it's often said that Thomas Paine is the author of the revolution. And this is because he writes Common Sense, which is during a time when many people in the colonies were really just looking for better representation. The idea of actual revolution and independence was not as inevitable as a lot of people may think. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense and convinces a lot of people that actually maybe independence is the goal here. And I think to this day, Common Sense is still the greatest selling American pamphlet now, and it's still in print, of course. He's not just the author of the American Revolution, though, of course. He's also the author of a text known as the Age of Reason. which espouses, sure, a philosophical deism. He says in no uncertain terms right at the beginning that he believes in one God, but also describes organized religions, including Christianity, as essentially conspiracies to conduct power and to hold monopolies over people. And in fact, this leads him into a great deal of controversy. He ends up narrowly escaping execution. He gets exiled. He dies, and then when his bones are dug up to be brought back over to England, they end up getting lost, and we still don't know where his bones are today. And about 6 people attended his funeral. And yet this man is the author of the American Revolution. Now, why is it that at the end of his life, he's treated with such disregard and contempt? It might have something to do with the fact that his own personal religious beliefs were, in no uncertain terms, not Christian.
I think what you just saw there is pretty clearly cherry picking on behalf of Alex O'Connor. And I say that with all due respect because I really like Alex. I've gone on record multiple times as I've dealt with some of the things that he said and have shown that I appreciate the approach that he brings to these subjects. I mean, he started this debate by saying the perfectly obvious thing, which is Christopher Hitchens is no philosopher.
That's another thing that we had in common, our shared suspicion of Christopher Hitchens as a philosophical thinker.
So I appreciate Alex here, but I think what he's doing here is just trying to cherry pick in order to prove his case. So he goes to one of our founders who was a pretty dogmatic deist and not necessarily a Christian, and he goes to Thomas Paine in order to just kind of uphold his personal beliefs as something that is more indicative of the broader founding of America, and I just don't think that's true. I think in order to see this, you even have to push the date further back than I did in the last clip, which is, let's just talk about the West as a whole. The West as a whole is undeniably a Christian experiment. And you may say, well, it's an experiment and like inquisitions and crusades and that kind of thing, which is just perfectly ahistorical and totally ignores so much of the benefit that Christians have provided to the West and brought to your life individual today. I mean, let's just put it this way. If Christianity didn't exist, medical science wouldn't be as advanced as it is today. Science as a whole wouldn't be as advanced as it is today. Thinking wouldn't exist as it is today. I mean, the Ivy League schools in America, like the vast majority of them, I can't think of many exceptions to this right offhand. There may be one, but I'm talking Princeton, Yale, Harvard, all of these places were founded by Christians. Go look at their founding mottos. They all have to do with God, and they all have to do with light, and they all have to do with truth. I mean, the truth is that the West is a tradition that is deeply rooted in Christianity, such that you would not understand what the West looks like today in any way whatsoever if Christianity wasn't a reality. This is what Tom Holland argues, who is a famous historian, and in his book Dominion, he says this: people in the West, even those who may imagine that they have emancipated themselves from Christian belief, in fact, are shot through with Christian assumptions about almost everything. All of us in the West are a goldfish, and that water that we swim in is Christianity, by which I don't necessarily mean that confessional form of the faith, but rather an entire civilization. So what I would argue, like Tom Holland, is that culture is the sum of learned behavior. And when I say that America is a Christian nation, what I don't mean is that you are a Christian if you're an American, or that you have a Bible and that you read it all the time, or that you have to be a Christian to be an American. I certainly don't even mean that we should reinstate the church as the epicenter of government and that a priest should be the leader of society. That's not what I'm saying. When I say that we are a Christian nation, what I mean just simply is this, is that the morals and values of Christianity are so interwoven into the fabric of our society that we would not have a society without those things, and that it influences us in ways that we don't even realize. Now, Jordan Peterson is probably the best on this when he says that you may not believe in God, but you act as though he exists. This is true. Whenever anybody wants to do what is good for their neighbor, whenever anybody believes that there is intrinsic value in another human being, those ideas aren't necessarily present in other cultures as they are in ours. And those ideas certainly are founded upon a religious tradition. I would even argue that our concept of good is deeply infused with an understanding of a scriptural understanding of what that actually means. We don't go around saying that the strong can overpower the weak, or that might means right. But throughout much of history, that's exactly the way in which we lived. And it was Christianity that overthrew that idea, that showed that the weaker deserves the right and the opportunity to speak just like the stronger. And frankly, that was embodied in what we did here in America. When we created a constitutional republic, we wanted the people to be able to have a say-so in their government. Well, where do you think that idea comes from? I can only tell you this. FDR said it succinctly, especially around the time of World War II, when he said that America is hated by Nazis and fascists and communists because it is Christian, and because it is Christian, it is democratic. All that to say that the people who walk around using separation of church and state to prove that we are a secular, hedonistic republic are totally wrong. And I give you one last argument from Alan Keyes to show that separation of church and state was never about the fact that we need to ensure a secular government.
Actually, if you look at the Constitution of the United States says nothing about separation of church and state.
Absolutely not.
The First Amendment, which they always cite, the Establishment Clause, actually says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. When you think it through, the real implication of that phrase also, though, is not to prohibit religious establishment. Some people argue that. No. What it says is Congress shall make no law respecting, not prohibiting, but respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, respecting means concerning, on the subject of, with regard to, dealing with. So it means Congress shall make no law that has anything whatsoever to do with religious establishment. Well, my friends, if it can't address the issue at all, that means it can't say yes to religious establishment, and it also can't say no. It can't interfere with anything that's done on this subject. So you'll ask me, okay, Alan, who can address it? Well, the Constitution's also clear about this. In the 10th Amendment, it says that any power that's not given to the United States government by the Constitution, or explicitly prohibited by the U.S. Constitution to the states, is reserved to the states respectively and to the people. That means that the power that was explicitly withheld from the federal government, the power to deal with the issue of religious establishment, and remember, that means all these issues that have to do with the relation between church and state, how you acknowledge God, whether you acknowledge God, what can be done, prayer in schools, display of monuments, all the whole range of issues that have to do with that subject, right? The federal government has no lawful authority to address those issues at all whatsoever.
What I love about Alan Keyes is that he is a reminder to each and every one of us that our politicians sound nothing like this man, and then it sends me into a state of depression, so pray for me. But beyond that, I also love Alan Keyes because he's 100% correct, and all he needs to do to be correct is not even to make a religious argument here, but simply look at the plain text of the Constitution, which says that the government shall not make any law respecting this thing, which means you need to be quiet, federal government. You have no place when it comes to laws that are relegated to state and local government. And all he, again, needs to do is just simply look at the verbiage. But I want to go a little bit deeper and show you that separation of church and state is nowhere mentioned in the First Amendment at all. And it has historically been seen until recently as a protection, especially of state and local government, from the federal government in terms of religious liberty. All the way up until 1947, this constitutional amendment was always seen as a protection for religious liberty until in 1947, Everson v. Board of Education. And in this landmark case, it was argued that an individual who was being reimbursed by the government of New Jersey, I think it was, for busing his child in to a private school using the public transit system, he could be reimbursed for that. It was argued that that was permissible, but also in siding with this man on religious freedom grounds, it was also argued that the wall of separation between church and state should be very, very high. So for the first time in American history, this obscure reference in a Thomas Jefferson letter became part of a landmark ruling in a Supreme Court case. And from here on out, it became the understanding of the vast majority of Americans, at least initially until our present, that the federal government's job was to protect itself against religious people rather than religious people having protections against the federal government. Now, here's why this is so important. I can sum up for you in something Gresham Machen said, who was a famous theologian, Greek scholar, and he said this: We may preach with fervor, and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there, if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. Essentially, what Machen is saying there is that if we see a world in which Christianity becomes absurd, we will lose the culture. And then strangely, slowly but surely, if you strip away the foundation on which this house is standing, you may find that you're not standing on anything anymore. For the life of me, I don't understand why any individual would want to militate against religious liberty and the importance of religious discourse in the public square. In doing so, you are militating against your own individual rights in favor of a big federal government. And obviously, that's really not a good idea. All I'd argue is that powers should be separated so no man or institution becomes too powerful. But where do you think that idea comes from? Of course, the separation of powers, the idea that men are neither angels nor demons, all of that comes from an understanding of original sin in the Bible. So yes, if we decide to create a society based upon Christian principles, it'll place an emphasis on monogamous heterosexual marriage as a bedrock for society for the continuation of the human race. And you may dislike that because you really like sodomy, but just be honest enough to realize your way is far less good for all of us. Christ's word and way created the best nation on the planet, and to deny that will see you cutting off your nose to spite your face. Would you really hate Christianity so much that you would use your voice to promote a godless, secular, federal hierarchy instead of the values that you find in the Bible that call all men to repentance, that hold us all accountable? Now listen, I understand a strong central church that rules the government can be just as bad as a federal government that is overpowered. But why would you cede your religious liberty and put it in the hands of a godless secular institution that cares more about power than it does about you? In either event, I hope we're finding more and more that the faith of our fathers that we have tried to reject like a bunch of spoiled children, honestly, is the thing that holds us together. And it's time to act like adults and admit that maybe our dad, heavenly, and maybe otherwise, that he actually had a point. And that now it's time to put the juice box down, it's time to put the controller down, Fortnite can wait, and it's time for us to pick up our Bible and engage in the hard work of restoring a Christian America before it's too late. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go with God.